his work is not necessarily only two-dimensional. It's glass, but it's refracting light, and reflecting light, and transmitting light.
It's about a huge sense of beauty. I think it's an engagement with light. It's an engagement with the way faith operates.
When you stand in front of Brian's stained glass, there's a feeling of euphoria. You're lifted and carried into another world. We can also be carried into tragedy and melancholia. So it's as though it's art as a process whereby human emotion is captured forever in material. Stained glass is widely misunderstood and categorized as being fundamentally a particular kind of religious art. It always was an art which was in cathedrals and churches, but it was elsewhere as well. And I think it really serves, when we look at Brian Clarke's stained glass, to show us that in actual fact what his art is about and what stained glass is about is a much wider idea of spirituality. Through the decades, Brian has worked not just in churches, synagogues, mosques, and other places of worship, but also in airports, arcades, and in private houses. The stained glass really is a ubiquitous medium. It can be anywhere, but it does retain this, for me, this feeling of a deeper spirituality. It's about the intangibility of coloured light and what that does to people when they look at it. One thing I think is really interesting in Brian Clarke's work is the ability he's got to deal with scale. He can move from epic-sized works, and he has made the single largest pieces of stained glass in the world at this stage. But at the same time, there's a sense of jewellery-like activity in his work as well, attention to detail and minutiae. His work goes through the scale range really very dramatically, from the size of architecture down to the size of a wedding ring.
Now this is a Brian ring. He did it for my birthday. It's like a kind of a freehand sketch made in gold, like a gold sketch. I draw very straight, smooth lines, and his is slightly crinkled. It's almost like drawing in space. And I haven't seen the recent stuff, but I think it should be really done like that, as if like you're drawing not on a canvas, but in a volume.
Line is a kind of vehicle that carries a multiplicity of ideas or feelings or whatever, emotions. Drawing for me, line for me, is kind of fundamental armature on which everything else kind of hangs, really. And sometimes one draws just because it's what one wants to do and it's the only thing that's sufficient to the moment. And at other times, it's a route to another experience.
I think Brian is not the normal artist. He can really communicate through his hand, through the pencil, through making spaces, because I think what he does with his stained glass pieces is really to create space. I've had him in the distant past as a critic on architectural juries. He seems to know more about architecture than most of the architects sitting in the same room. You're now working in ceramic. You work in dividing spaces, you work in translucent materials of every kind. And of course he's a painter of extraordinary vigour. His studio is just gobsmacking. You go in there and it's like in the best sense, a factory, but it's like a sort of factory it's almost like a sweet factory. There's so many amazing things coming out of every kind. I'm very envious of his amazing productivity, but he's been like that for the 40 years that I've known him.
within 5 minutes of meeting Brian Clarke, he will have told you 4 times that he comes from Oldham. And for me, this is a very, very important part of his outlook on life. He's obviously incredibly interested and intensely proud of his northern heritage in Oldham. Quite a lot of his work is to do with memory and looking back at his childhood. He came across stained glass as a young lad. By the time he was 20, he was experimenting alongside his painting with the idea of stained glass. I find his response to the punk movement interesting. In the 70s, punk was not so much a general anarchistic revolution. It really was a move away from the previous generation of cultural practice. The false utopias and optimisms of the world that we were all given. Punk was really very much about a generation of people kicking things into touch.
I think that you can't afford to compromise. If you're making a statement artistically, then when you're making that statement, as far as you're concerned, it's an absolute. And any variation or dilution or subtraction from an absolute makes it less than absolute, and therefore makes it untrue, and therefore by definition a lie. And I am not a perpetrator of visual lies.
That oppositionalism can be found in his work. There's something confrontational in quite a complicated way, not overt, but nevertheless always present. His work deals with contrariness and contradiction, as well as lyricism and the euphoria of form and colour.
The cold light of day, a pause out of thee.
I met Brian Clarke so long ago that it's remarkable I can remember. It must have been 74, 75. He was in his early 20s, already working both as a painter and in stained glass. And there's always been a parallel cross-germinating in his work. And because of the nature of stained glass and the scale involved, he developed in another direction than from painting. Painting remains relatively small compared to some of his larger works. He gets an awful lot of ideas for his stained glass from his painting. I realized that he instantly challenged various preconceived notions that were rooted in the history of stained glass. The narrative, that's huge. And then Brian starts to extend this with his constructivist dialogue, which then included what I believe was his quantum leap. I believe when he challenged the leading, it became a sculptural component of the infrastructure. It wasn't supporting the content, it was included as content. Sometimes I look at the image of the stained glass, and sometimes I look at how it's supported, because this is an architectural concern. And as we know, he was completely fluent in all architectural thought. When he started examining the leading, both either including it or excluding it, or using it to make shapes, articulate shapes, calligraphic shapes, just because it was a medium in and of itself on top of the glass, not necessarily the support. I think that same lead started to bleed into his mixture of the colors of the glass. He's also made an enormous contribution to the palette. He's been able to do things that were undreamt of before. I was recently in his studio, and it's a jaw-dropping experience to see the dimensions that he embraces.
Brian, he's just an extraordinary, vivid person to engage with. There are always people wanting to interact with his creative vitality. I think he's a deeply spiritual person. His spirituality may come through beauty and form and style. He has a very strong instinct for that.
J'ai entendu dire sur ça qu'il se dise agnostique. Alors je me dis comment un homme, il doit avoir une fibre si profondément religieuse, je ne sais pas comment il est arrivé à y mettre un tel message. Et je dois dire que ça me touche profondément. Et on peut, c'est génial à tous les niveaux. Non seulement de la création artistique, mais aussi du message chrétien.
I do believe that art has a much greater function to fulfil than the decoration of bourgeois drawing rooms, and that function exists in public buildings. Of that there is no doubt, and equally there's no doubt that that is the future.
The totality of Brian Clarke's work corresponds with a number of the very grand masters of modernism, in the sense of an underlying belief in the ability of art to transform consciousness. The idea that beauty in itself can be transformatory. Artistic practice has the ability to change the shape of things, has the ability to transform the world.